Welcome to for May 31st in the year of our Lord 2023. So glad you could be with us today. As you know, this program is set aside for you to ask your questions, give your comments on any topic whatsoever. And I, as your host, shall endeavor to answer your questions to the best of my ability using our Catholic faith, tradition, scripture, the fathers, the medievals, the popes, the councils, the catechisms, the encyclopedias, the saints, the doctors, and just about anything I can find to help you walk away satisfied that your question has indeed been answered. We come to you every Wednesday from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, barring any problems, which we haven't had many to speak of. And usually at the top of the program, I have a topic that I want to cover, and today is one of those days. Someone wrote in an email question and wanted to know about the topic of canonizations of the saints. Something that we thought was clear and upfront, and because we've had some changes, we have relooked at this whole question of are canonizations infallible? You know, infallibility is that thing which distinguishes the Catholic Church from every other church, because no other church claims to be infallible, if we can call them churches. And with much responsibility, requires much evidence to support the claims. Okay. And we would normally think that, when Jesus gave the command to Peter in Matthew 16, that when he says, whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven, there was where we get our understanding of infallibility. Because, as I've said many times, if heaven can't lie, then Peter can't lie. And that means heaven is protecting Peter from making any error. But that only applies to the situations or the events, the writings of the Pope in which he declares that he's infallible. If he doesn't declare he's infallible in this particular writing, then, of course, we have an authoritative writing from the Pope, but we don't have an infallible writing, which means it could be reformed later by another pope. But if it's infallible and irreformable, then that means that it can't be changed by anybody, even the Pope. We go by that definition as Catholics because it's very helpful to distinguish truth from error and what is bound to us to believe under pain of excommunication, as opposed to things that have been stated by the Church authoritatively but don't carry the anathemas or the excommunications that would entail the highest infallible teachings of the Church. So with that, the issue of canonization comes up, and my friend Michael from Australia, yes, we have many patrons from Australia, believe it or not, and he wrote an email to me, wanted me to look at a video. And remember, I said a few weeks ago that if you have a video you want me to look at and get my opinion, I'll be glad to do it. And this was one of them. Somebody else sent in a video or wanted me to look at a video, and I looked at part of it, and we'll probably be covering that next week. And that deals with husband and wife relationships and things of that sort. And what is the role for Catholic women today? Are they supposed to be career women? Or if they're not, are they free to be career women and raise children at the same time? And what's the husband's role as, the one everybody's supposed to submit to in the family? all that kind of stuff. So we'll go over that next time, and that would be what, June the 6th, I think. So right now, we are going to go over this a little bit, and I did look at the whole video. It was an hour and 40 minutes long, and I took some notes. So I'm going to go through those. Now, I have to say at the beginning that I was not persuaded by the gentleman who was doing the video that canonizations are infallible, and I don't think he was quite sure himself, especially at the end. I think even though he's partial to the fact that canonizations are infallible, that he still has some doubt in his mind. He has a question in his mind. And his name was Dr. John Jay. I had never seen him before, but he's quite good, very thorough in his research, and tries to hit every angle, every corner, and give him credit for that too. It's just that I don't think he proved his conviction. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to go over that a little bit right now. I would say the first logical point would be that the fact that we're still discussing this today, and there's a lot of people that have been discussing it, not only now, but in the late 1800s, there was a lot of discussion going on when you would think that there would be no need for it to go on because we don't have the same problems then as we do today. And if you don't know what the problems are, here's the problem. We've got Pius XII, who's been hanging on for how many years now after World War II, not a canonized saint. And yet we have John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul the 2nd, and probably soon Benedict the 16th. If we follow the pattern that's been set by Pope Francis during his pontificate, he sainted all these popes, and the irony is twofold. One is these popes, it's common knowledge that these popes did not live according to the heroic virtues that are required by saints, at least not in every area of their life. And some areas stick out like a sore thumb. John Paul II and his total dismissal of the pedophile homosexual scandal going on under his nose for most of his pontificate. Paul VI, I even hate to get into some of the stuff that he was into. John the 23rd, same thing, probably not as bad, but still just doubts all over the place of what kind of man he really was. So, and it's ironic that we have 3 popes in a row, basically, that are canonized as saints, and yet there were only, 5 popes, maybe, throughout Christendom, 2,000 years, that were canonized as saints, and most of those were in the first millennium. The second millennium, I think we have 2, possibly 3, and that's it. So it's like, where's all this sainthood coming from? 3 popes in a row who are suspect in their own lives of living the heroic virtues that are supposed to be of saints. What's going on? And then the same popes basically are the ones that diluted the criteria for being a saint. That doesn't sit too well. I mean, if you and the popes around you are now sainted, and the criteria for sainthood has been diluted so much, that doesn't speak well, okay? Especially when we're debating this whole area of our canonizations infallible. But just the fact that, as I said, that we're debating this issue still means it's not infallible. I think ipso facto it means that, because if it was infallible, nobody would be arguing the point. Everybody would know, hey, that's infallible. Oh, can you tell me where? Yeah, it's right here. Read it. Canonizations are infallible and irreformable, and anybody who goes against them will be excommunicated. Do we have any statement like that in the church? No, not even close. The closest we have is Pius XI or Pius XII saying that the that they are deeming a person they're deeming a saint. This has been stated infallibly, or we declare and define, and this is infallible. Well, that's, unfortunately, as I've said many times with this whole infallible thing, um, uh, is that they don't define what infallibility really is and when it applies. And everybody's guessing about, oh, this is infallible, that's infallible. I run into this a lot with the Galileo issue. Oh, well, that's not infallible. So we don't have to pay attention to that at all. As a matter of fact, we can just wholesale dismiss it from our Catholic pedigree, patrimony, and pretend like it never existed. Okay. And yet, I can show you places where Urban VIII declared and defined that Galileo went against the Holy Scriptures and called it a heresy to say that the Earth went around the sun. Okay, I can show you language like that very easily. It's in all my books. But who pays attention to it? Nobody. Nobody pays attention to it. Why? Well, because it's not infallible. It's not infallible. Well, who's to say? Are they the ones to determine whether something declared and defined and is actually its opposition was called a heresy? They're going to tell us, and not the church, that, well, it's not infallible. Okay. So here you run into this whole problem. What's infallible mean? What does it mean? So we have Pius the 11th and 12th using the word infallible in their formula for a canonization of a saint, and yet other theologians can say, well, it's not infallible in the dogmatic sense because it doesn't have an anathema attached to it. It doesn't bind the whole Christian church to it. It just says we're saying this infallibly, but that's not enough. Apparently, that's not enough. It has to be crystal clear. And was it Canon 749, I think it is, where it says nothing is to be assumed as infallible unless it's expressly stated so. Okay, that's pretty close to what we would need. That's canon law. Unless it's expressly stated, you can't say anything is infallible. Okay, so what does that require? Well, that requires that we know exactly what it means for something to be infallible. And yet this is where the church has not given the clearest definition. Even Vatican I, with its 4 criteria, that's not even clear because, first of all, the council never finished its deliberations on this very topic of infallibility. And we have those 4 criteria, but even because you could find those same 4 criteria in the Galileo issue, that he was teaching on faith and morals, that he bound the church to that because he sent the Pope sent letters out to all the papal nuncios and universities, told them you had to obey this decree by the church on the Galileo issue, and we want to have your compliance. And if they didn't get the compliance, they sent people out there to get the compliance. They made a tight ship of that whole thing. It was faith and morals because why? Because exactly what the Pope said. It was a heresy because it went against Holy Scripture. Okay, because Holy Scripture was clear that the sun went around the earth. Okay, and the Pope took his office. He was actually presided over the trial of Galileo, and declared this is a heresy that Galileo was preaching. Now, how could he call it a heresy? Now, I don't mean to get into the Galileo issue here, but it's a good analogy to what's going on here to show how we sort of pick and choose as Catholics what we want to accept as infallible. Okay. And partly the problem is because the church hasn't given us a list of what's infallible. That's the problem. Even Dr. John Jay, in his little talk here, was talking about all the condemnations the popes gave, like 101 against the Jansenists and 40 against Luther and another 40 against John Hus and John Wycliffe and all this. Now the question came up, are these infallible? Okay. And yet there's so many of them, and we still don't know. I mean, after you listen to John Jay talk, it's like, do we really know whether they're still infallible or not? Because they could have had historic infallibility in the sense that they applied to that time, but do they still apply to our time? That's another question that comes up. Okay. So this whole thing with infallibility, as good as it is for the church to separate itself from every other would-be church out there that, don't have the courage to claim themselves infallibility, and that's good, actually. But if we do, well, we better shore up what we mean by infallibility, where it applies and when it applies. And that's exactly the difficulty. Because if they had done that with canonizations, we wouldn't be discussing it right now. Okay? And if there's doubt, that means that we can't dogmatically say that canonizations are infallible. Okay? So, now he tries to say, he says the canonization basically means that someone is in heaven and not necessarily admirable. He says that's sort of the lowest common denominator, that they could be in heaven and yet not be worth our esteem as an object of veneration or a person of veneration that we can pray to be the mediator between us and God in certain favors that we want. That's certainly a strange way to look at canonizations. Okay. Because, people who try to preserve the infallibility of canonizations will often retreat to this diluted form where they say, okay, it just means they're in heaven. It doesn't mean they're, had a heroic life on earth and had all miracles or whatever. It just means they're in heaven. Well, if that's the case, then why have it in the first place? Okay. We know there's many Catholics who die in the state of grace who go to heaven, but they're not distinguished like, oh, well, we have these read in our after Mass sometimes. This Mass is for the repose of the soul of John Smith. Okay. And so, and we all know John was a good guy. He went to confession. He went to the Eucharist. He did many things for the church. Okay. But he's ho-hum compared to what some of these other saints were supposed to be. Okay. And yet now we're told in order to preserve the infallibility of canonizations, well, we'll just take the esteem part out, or we'll lessen it, dilute it, and we'll only say, well, it just means they're in heaven. And as I said, why have it in the first place then? Okay. I mean, let's be commonsensical about this. If we can't honor and esteem the people that we deem as saints who have led these heroic lives and appeal to them to be our intermediary between us and God for favors on earth, then why have them? Okay. So that definition doesn't make any sense. And even John Jay says there's a range of views among scholars. And I think he picked about 4 of them out. Different views of canonization. Okay. Which means this matter is not settled. And if anything, in the last, 50, 60 years, it's been brought to the surface again. Because, and maybe this is the way God is working. It could be that we are now discussing again because it's high time that we get this thing fixed and stop, guessing, basically, is what we're doing on whether something is infallible or whether canonizations are infallible. Okay. Like I said, the doctrine is great. Fallibility is great, but there's a lot of holes that need to be filled. And This is one of them. Okay, so now he went back to Benedict XIV, who had a formula for canonizations, and Benedict XIV, 1700s. I had to deal with him a lot in the Galileo issue because he made some changes on how we should view Galileo and all that. But he was the one, I believe, who established that we had to have 4 miracles, and not only 4 miracles, but 4 valid miracles, not something that looked like it was a miracle, but was actually a natural event. Like somebody being cured of cancer. Or even the one used for John Paul II, which was what? It was something internal. I forget exactly what it was. But somebody prayed to John Paul II, and something was, I guess she received a favor. And so that counted as a miracle. And I think it was cerebral palsy. Okay. But if you look up cerebral palsy, that can, in one day, it can turn from being under cerebral palsy to not having it without any medical explanation. They just don't know. And no miracles were performed on the person. And other times it just sticks around for years, decades. Okay. It's just something they don't know too much about. So that would be suspect as a potential miracle to canonize somebody. But and so that's why the church was very rigorous. That's the correct word. The church under Benedict XIV was very rigorous in their determination of whether something was truly a miracle. And if there was any doubt, it would not be counted. Okay. So someone who claimed to be cured of cancer, that would still be doubtable. Okay. Because we don't know a whole heck of a lot about cancer and still don't. And that's why we haven't cured it yet. Okay. So, at least the church of that year, 300 and some years ago, was very diligent. Okay. But this brings up the whole question of why we need criteria in the first place. Okay. And it's an argument that goes around in circles after a while. But let me continue with what Benedict had declared. First of all, you need 4 legitimate, undoubtable miracles. You need an examination by what they call the devil's advocate. And it's his job, whether he likes it or not, okay, because maybe the guy who died and is being canonized or whatever was his friend, okay? Doesn't make any difference. His job is to go in there and try to find something that is going to put a black spot on this white page. That's his job. That's why he's called the devil's advocate. He's looking to accuse the person of something wrong in his life. And he's not looking to cover anything up, so to speak, okay? Which is basically what the promoter of the faith is today, who replaced the devil's advocate. That's what he does. He looks at it from a positive standpoint. He's not out to find dirt. If he does find dirt, is going to try to cover it up if he can. I don't mean that crassly, okay? I don't mean like, oh, yeah, we found dirt, now we have to make sure nobody knows about it kind of thing. No, I mean that he's not going to go into, if he sees some dirt, he's not going to go in and investigate it, so to speak. He's just, going to try to paint a much prettier picture of the person who's up for canonization than would be Benedict XIV, who created the devil's advocate to paint a bad picture, as bad as he possibly can, of this person. And of course, then they would go and all consult about it, but at least the evidence would be there. And the people responsible for canonizing would have all the information they need. Okay, good, bad, and ugly. And and then, of course, you had a long period of waiting time for these candidates for canonization. You know, like my favorite saint, Robert Bellarmine, he wasn't canonized till 1934, believe it or not. For all the good that he did for the church, he fought Galileo, he fought the Protestants, and he lived an impeccable life. And it wasn't until 300 years later he's declared a saint. Okay, Saint Hildegard, who was just declared a saint and doctor of the church by Pope Benedict in 2012, lived in the 1100s. Well known for her good deeds and miraculous works. And let me add this, she was a geocentrist. Yeah. And, so we got almost 900 years later, she's made a saint and doctor of the church. Okay, so what was it? John Paul II, within 5 years, he was made a saint, and nobody really investigated his life, and they all knew about it. I mean, how could you avoid the pedophile homosexual scandal that went on during his pontificate, and he just turned a blind eye to it? How do you avoid that? Everybody knows about it. Okay, the buck stops with the Pope. Whether he was directly involved or indirectly, it doesn't make any difference. It's under his pontificate. And when he was shown the evidence, he turned a blind eye to it because it was his friend, Maciel, who was then excommunicated by Pope Benedict as soon as John Paul II died. So he knew it stunk. Okay? So the point I was making was it took a long time to make a saint. Didn't happen overnight. And with John Paul II's case, it happened overnight. So again, suspicion. If it's just not downright rejection of the canonization infallibility, it's suspicion. Okay, it's under suspicion, and rightly so. Okay. So he goes on and he says that those who are against canonizations say that it's not revealed by heaven. Okay. It's not part of revelation. And this is why we had miracles. We had 4 miracles required because miracles can only come from heaven. So if there are 4 legitimate miracles in someone's life and he's up for canonization, that's pretty good evidence that although it's not direct revelation, it's indirect revelation and from heaven, because only miracles can come from heaven, that this guy, okay, deserves to be canonized. So here, this brings up the real problem on the criteria issue, and that is, if 4 miracles, legitimate miracles that are not like some internal bodily, healing that occurs by itself, but 4 legitimate miracles, like raising someone from the dead, or putting a limb back on somebody, or, whatever, something that's obviously a miracle. Somebody walked on water, whatever it was that they did. There was no question that it was a miracle. But today, not only did they reduce the amount of miracles to 2, those miracles do not go through the rigor that they used to. So somebody could slip by with a pretense of a miracle, but it wasn't really a miracle. Okay. So once you dilute it, the question is, why are you diluting it? If it worked good in the past and canonizations were infallible, then why dilute it? You see, because you're defeating your own purpose. You're saying canonizations are infallible, And the reason we know that is because we have indirect revelation from heaven because there's 4 legitimate miracles. Okay, that works. Then keep it that way. Why would you then go and reduce the number to 2 if the canonizations are infallible to begin with? What makes a difference whether you have 4, 14, 0, or whatever? If canonizations are infallible, the number is arbitrary. Who thought up the number 4 in the first place anyway? Okay. So, but it shows psychologically what's happening. Because if canonizations are infallible, automatically, heaven's going to make it known, that is, and it's not going to allow us to make a mistake, then what's the psychology about reducing it to 2? And then when you couple that with the fact that John Paul II replaced the devil's advocate with the promoter of the faith, so that the examination of the person's life would not be as rigorous, would have its limits, because the devil's advocate had no limits. When you couple those two things together, what does it come out to be that the real reason for doing that is? Well, that's to have more saints. To have more saints. Like we don't have enough saints already. Okay. And what do we need more saints for? Is this a popularity contest or something? Like we're in high school? I mean, what do we need more saints for, declared saints? I mean, we already know that people who live the Catholic life in grace and die in grace go to heaven. We already know that. God's going to take care of all that. So what do we need more saints for? And not only more saints, but we had John Paul II canonized more people as saints than all the other popes before him in history. Now, doesn't that tell you something also? Okay. So what is it? What was it that was going on around this time? And then, of course, Francis pops the cork with canonizing, the last 3 popes before him willy-nilly, just like, let's get it done fast. No real examination of their life. Flimsy miracles we'll use. Doesn't make, one of the, it doesn't make any difference. And bang, bang, bang. They're all sainted. And some of the most notorious popes that we've had in the papacy. I'm not saying they're that bad, like the Borgia popes or whatever, but these guys were had some real question marks on their life. Okay? So, let me go on to, there's some other things I want to cover here about this issue that I would say that in my research of this, which has gone on for many years now, one of the best papers that were written on this was by Dr. John Lamont. Was written, I believe, in 2018. And he and I agree a lot. And so I'm going to read some of the things that he has in his paper that will solidify some of the things I've already said, and I'll reiterate some of them. All right, so I'm trying to sift through them to see what the best ones are here. Maybe I should start with the last point that he made, which I thought was very good. And that is, it is thus acceptance rather than denial of the infallibility of canonizations that threatens the morals of the faithful. That's quite a statement, John. But I happen to agree with you. And this threat, let me read that again, just in case you didn't hear it. It is thus the acceptance rather than the denial of the infallibility of canonizations that threatens the morals of the faithful. And this threat is being realized right now. If we accept that John Paul II and Paul VI were saints, we must accept that their catastrophic failures in carrying out their duties of state did not interfere with their possession of holiness and exemplification of heroic virtue. It means that Paul VI's protection and promotion of heretical clergy and John Paul II's inaction in the face of clerical pedophilia, to name only a few of their failures, made no difference to their going straight to heaven after death. Now, so what John is saying here is that the issue shouldn't be whether canonizations are infallible. Now it's reached a point where if you accept them as infallible, you do tremendous harm to the faithful patrons of the Catholic Church, because now they have to reconcile a statement of canonization of a pope that they know was not living the heroic life that used to be required of saints. And it's not even neutral. It's like, this guy did something that is beyond the pale, turning his blind eye to the pedophilia scandal that was going on in his very pontificate, and who said, I'm not going to do anything about it because I think this is just a trick to accuse priests so that they can bring the church down, because that's what the Germans used to do in World War II. Have you ever heard such a lame excuse in your life when your own CDF prefect, Cardinal Ratzinger, is telling you this is going on, you need to pay attention to this, and all the other cardinals around him in his curia telling him this is going on, we have proof of it? No, not going to look at it. Okay? And we see the results of it today. It's gotten so bad that some of us are scared to send our kids to church, wondering what's going to happen to them if they're not in our sight 24/7. Okay? And then on top of that's the Assisi scandal. This pope invites pagans to pray to their false gods for what? World peace. Not only once in 1986, but 5 other times after that, and then the grand finale in 2002. And his own curia were telling him, this is wrong, this is an abomination. Oh no, you got to reach out to all men, Yeah, we can reach out to all men, but tell them to pray to their own gods? What's the gospel for then? If they can get favors from God by praying to their pagans who don't even exist, what's the gospel for? If they can get favors from God elsewhere. Okay? This is the man that was sainted within 5 years of his death. Okay? So we got a problem, a real problem for the people of the church, because they look at his life and they look at the fact that he's canonized and they're, well, what the heck is Catholicism? You see, that's how serious it goes. So John is right here. When you canonize someone who shouldn't be canonized, you've created a real moral problem, faith and moral problem for the people of the Catholic Church. Okay? So let me see some of the other things that he said, which were very good. Another way he said it was a real threat to the morals of the faithful will arise only if they accept that canonizations are infallible. So John just turned the tables totally. Okay. Let's see what else he says here. If the faithful come across evidence of these sins, they could either reject this evidence as not proving that the canonized person actually sinned. Okay. So let's say you don't believe that John Paul II was the culprit in the pedophile scandal and the homosexual scandal that we still have, as was Paul VI. He started the whole thing, letting the homosexuals in the seminaries, and he's allegedly a homo himself. I mean, there's a book written out there that tells you who his lovers were. Now, I'm just going to say alleged because I don't know for absolute proof that he was, but that's the allegation. And the evidence is there. Okay? And this guy sainted? Okay. He says, or accept it as showing that the purported saint really was a sinner. Only in the latter case would a threat to their morals arise. But they would have a simple remedy available to them for this threat. They could conclude that because the person was a sinner, their canonization must have been erroneous, and that the purported saint is not, in fact, a model of virtue worthy of emulation. See, so this is a double whammy. Not only do canonization, not only are they not infallible, but it protects the person who, if he sees someone being canonized, is not scandalized because he knows this guy did not lead a moral life. Okay? Especially considering the fact that there's only 2 miracles required and they can be flimsy. There's no devil's advocate. We just got the promoter of the faith, and it happened quick within 5 years. Like, let's get it done before they really dig into his life and find out, yeah, he's not the saint that we thought he was. Okay? That's the context surrounding all this. So if it's not infallibly declared that he's a saint, well, that saves the people, you see, because many times on the other side of this issue, the promoters of infallibility of canonizations will say, well, it's going to scandalize the people because they see the church doing something, and now it says what the church did was wrong, and they got to start over again. That's scandalizing. You know what? I'd rather have that. I'd rather have the other scandalizing than this one. I'd rather it be the case that the church could be wrong on something. Okay. In the space of the fact that they have never declared that canonizations are infallible. Okay, that's another issue here. So if they've never declared it and they make a mistake, okay, well, we can understand that. Okay, but if you claim to be infallible when you're canonizing and everybody knows you made a mistake, well, that's much more scandalizing than seeing the church make a mistake about who should be canonized. Okay, that's an easy one. So let me move on here. I'm going backwards, but he gives a good example here, one I've used a lot, and that's Pope Honorius. And here was a church who made a mistake, a doctrinal mistake of significant import, who said in an official letter to the Bishop of the East, Sergius, that Christ only had one will. Okay? They were called the Monothelites. Big heresy, big issue back then. Okay? So the church figured, okay, Honorius was a heretic, but he didn't preach this heresy from the formal seat of the Pope, but only in a private pastoral way to Sergius, yet it still was an official letter. Okay, because nothing goes out from the Vatican with the Pope's name on it unless it's official. And in this case, it just hasn't reached the definition of papal infallibility from the chair ex cathedra. Now, that's all interesting, too, because the church wouldn't define what that meant until 1,200 years later in 1870, when the church finally got around to defining what papal infallibility was. And yet, the criterion for papal infallibility was used against Honorius in the 6th century to declare that he was a heretic, endorsed by Pope Leo II. Honorius's name appeared in the Liber Diurnus, which is a record of all, heretical things that happened up until the 1400s. Okay. So they made a mistake. And yet you had someone filling the chair of Peter. So you have to make a distinction now between what officially the chair of Peter says infallibly and what the official message of the Pope is to a bishop who's giving him a doctrinal advice or whatever. Okay, you have to put it on a lower rung, because you cannot say that the Pope is fallible when he's giving a dogmatic teaching on faith and morals. Okay, otherwise you bring the whole church down. Okay, so they had to make a distinction. Well, what does the distinction do? It shows us that they can make mistakes. Yeah, mistakes that reverberate for centuries in the church. We're still talking about Honorius, and there's still discussions going on about what the whole nature of the thing. Okay, even that's not settled yet among theologians. So once you admit that the church can make a mistake, okay, not a deliberate one, well, maybe some are deliberate, who knows? That more or less clears up this issue, okay? Because as we said, Canon 749 says, unless it is manifestly evident that something is infallible, then it's not infallible. Okay? Manifestly evident. That's like the highest you can go up the ladder. Okay? Now, the problem with Canon 749 is what? That it doesn't tell us what the other criterion are to be manifestly evident. It just leaves it wide open. Here was the chance for canon law to tell us, okay, here's what makes it manifestly evident. Bang, 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 bang. And that would have solved the problem, at least eliminated a lot of the discussion. But it didn't. It just said manifestly evident. All right, so here we go again. Now we're all going to discuss what does manifestly evident mean and what fulfills that criteria. Okay, so this is like a rabbit hole that you can go down and keep going down. Unless you take care of it up top, you're going to have these problems. Let me see if there's anything else here that we need to cover. Yeah, he gives a lot more examples and good stuff like that. And he also brings out a point I hadn't thought of, which was beatifications are not, in fact, infallible. So somebody could go up the ladder of the canonization ladder. First you're, you're beatified, then you're blessed, and none of those previous rungs on the ladder are infallible. Okay, so the infallibility issue only occurs when you get to the top. Okay, so and he also shows the circular argumentation that the pro-infallible canonization people use, which is basically So if you say that canonizations are infallible because the Pope cannot lead the church into error through canonizing someone who is not in heaven, you are simply saying that canonizations are infallible because they are infallible. So that's a circular argument. It's not going to. And he also talks about St. Thomas. He's the one that says, the church cannot be found in an error on this issue when it's talking about a saint, and that would be a scandal. Well, as John pointed out, the other side of that scandal is just think how about more scandalous it is when you canonize somebody who the people know are not saints. They know it. They see it. Okay? You don't have to have a college degree to be able to figure it out. Okay? You don't. As a matter of fact, sometimes all you need is the suspicion of these high crimes and misdemeanors among some of these popes, and that's enough to at least stall the canonization process. But that's not what happened in John Paul's case. He was ramrodded right through there. So nobody could point the finger at him later. And now we have all this problem in the church, thanks to Francis. Okay? Speaking of making mistakes, this guy's got a truckload of them. And we have even some of my good friends questioning whether this guy's the Pope or not, making so many mistakes in his papacy. Fortunately, none of them have been on the infallible level, so we don't have to worry on that count. But as far as, making statements about Catholic doctrine, you just never know. It's like playing the roulette wheel with this guy. You don't know whether it's going to land on red or black. So, that whole question is there, and it's not going away anytime soon. For every argument I've heard, and you know what? I wish canonizations could be infallible, and I wish a pope would come out and say, discussion's over. Canonizations are infallible. No ifs, ands, or buts. And if you do, I'm going to excommunicate you. I would love to hear something like that. Okay? But we're not. Okay? But until that happens, we're going to keep discussing it until Jesus returns. Okay? And of course, then we'll know the truth. We'll see who's in heaven to see who was right and wrong. All right. So I'm going to leave that as it is. There's a lot more I could say, but I think you've got the gist of it. All right. So we are going to go to our questions today. Remember, when you ask a question, put the word question in front of your question and put it in capital letters so that I know it's a question when I scroll down this chat board here. And be polite and respect everybody, and try to limit your questions to 2 or 3, and then we'll go from there. Okay? All right. Question: if despite research and goodwill, I cannot convince myself of the truth of Catholicism according to Catholic doctrine, will I go to hell anyway if I abandon the Catholic faith? Well, on paper, yes. Okay? But then there's a God who's behind the paper. Okay? And he will judge your heart to determine what your motivations were, what your education was, what was it that pointed you out of the church, family upbringing, what kind of life you led. All those things are going to be considered. Why? Because he's the perfect judge. Okay? So that's why I say, on paper, yes, you would go to hell because you check all the boxes. Okay? Whether God sees it that way or not, with all the mitigating information and circumstantial evidence and blah, 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 because life is complicated. he is going to be your judge. Okay. And you know his verdict is going to be true and trustworthy. Okay. But my plea to you would be, why take that chance? Okay. Why take the chance? Um, you know, you're better than a lot of Catholics I know. At least you're asking the questions and trying to find answers. There's a lot of Catholics out there been baptized, confirmed, go up and receive the Eucharist every week, and they don't have a clue what the Catholic faith is about. Okay? Most of them come on Easter and Christmas thinking they fulfill their obligation. Most of them don't believe in the Eucharist. They hardly follow the Pope. Okay? That's why among Catholics, there's 2.3 children per family now. Why? Because everybody's contracepting. Okay? So, I mean, here's people who are deliberately disobeying what the church says. Okay? At least you have a conscience and you're questioning. Okay? So my plea to you would be, just put all that debt on the shelf. Come in, enjoy, and that way you don't take any chances. Okay? You just come in and you abide in this short little life that you have. What, maybe you're 30 years old? Who knows? I don't know. Which means you got, 30, 40 years left. Okay? I just have a few years left. Why would I want to risk it? All eternity for just a few years of doubt and say, well, I don't want to be part of the church because I doubt this or I doubt that. There's a lot of things in the church to doubt. Okay? But we accept it. Just accept it. You're nothing. Okay? You are a little cog in the wheel. A grass blade growing in the great field of grass. That's all you are. Okay? And there's going to be things that you're never going to find out. So just don't take the risk. It's not worth it. Okay? But if you want to know, as I said, I'll repeat it. On paper, yeah, you would go to hell. Okay? All right. First part of the question. On May 21st, a solemn Novus Ordo Mass was celebrated by Archbishop of Mormia to commemorate Copernicus and De Revolutionibus from Poland. All right, so let me find the second part. Copernicus was praised there by the Archbishop as the man of faith and knowledge, the one who brought God's truth closer to us. Any comments? Yeah, well, this is the way the world goes, including the church. Okay? You would think that if there's the slightest doubt about Copernicus and Galileo, and especially with what science has brought to us these days, it's just totally different than back in Newton's time or Galileo's time. We've got so sophisticated experiments, it boggles my mind how they could even been thought of to do, much less produce the results that we have today that show us that the Earth is not moving, it's in the center of the universe. But you would think that once this news came out, people would be like, oh my gosh, heaven's finally open. We finally resolved this whole thing between Galileo and the church. Now we see why the Holy Spirit was guiding the church against Galileo. Now we see it right before our eyes. No, because we are in an apostasy, basically. Just look at the church. Look at it. We got homos and pedophiles running around as if there's no tomorrow. And it gets worse, And it's not just in the Novus Ordo Church. It's in the SSPX also, and the FSSP. Yeah. And they cover it up as much as they can. Okay? So they're all involved. And Christianity today, I mean, it's just as far as it could be. Well, maybe it's got a little further to go. But they don't want to hear the truth, okay? They don't want to hear it. And that's why all the major Catholic apologists there have banned me, because they just don't want to listen to Sungenis and his geocentrism, as if this could be true. Okay? And they've let me know that. Okay? So they're part of the problem. Okay? They're part of the problem. And so, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that, they'd have a commemoration for Copernicus. This is the god of the most of the people in the church today. Einstein and Copernicus and Newton, those are their gods. That's who they worship. Okay? And they've forgotten about the Holy Spirit. This is nothing new. This has been going on since time immemorial. Okay? So you're witnessing it right here. You're seeing the destruction take place. All right. Let me go on to the next question. Since Jesus is the all-knowing God, why didn't he know that there was no fruit on the fig tree? And what was the point of cursing a tree? Well, I cover this a lot in my commentary, but you got to remember, Remy, that Jesus was God and man. The man part of him didn't know a whole heck of a lot compared to the divine part. Okay? The man part was just like you as a man or me as a man. We know some things, but we certainly can't predict the future. I've tried that a couple times and it didn't work. And that's the part. See, sometimes we just don't know what part of Jesus is being addressed in the Gospels. Okay? Most of the time, it's the man part. The divine part is a little mysterious. We don't know exactly the times that it comes in where Jesus uses it, but it's very rare. Very rare. The whole purpose of him coming as a man was to put his divine prerogatives on the shelf. That's what Philippians 2, verses 7 to 9 tells us. Okay? So he put it on the shelf, and he came and he acted like a man. In most of the instances, there's only a few, couple, 3 maybe, where he allows his divine nature to come out. And that's only for a special purpose. Okay? So when we're reading the Gospels, we're reading of a person who sees things like you and I do. Now, he has a lot of intuition, a lot of wisdom, along with that, okay, that helps him come out of situations, okay? He prays to God for hours and hours on the mountainside in preparation for the next day. He's praying as a man to God to help him on his next day's activities, okay? And however God does it through the Spirit, he gives him wisdom, and Jesus teaches it. Okay? So when he sees the fig tree and he comes back to see if it has figs and it doesn't have figs, this is from his human nature that he is experiencing this issue, this event. Okay? And even from his human nature, is he condemning Jerusalem through the fig tree? Because he says, I've come all this time to get fruit from you, and I have none. And I see none growing on the tree. And so you will be cursed from this day forward forever. And what he's doing there basically is telling Jerusalem, your judgment is coming. And that's like a week before he is ready to go to Jerusalem. He spends his time out there in Bethany and Bethphage, where that fig tree is, in preparation for his time to go to Jerusalem. And he takes his final walk there a few days into the Passion Week. And he goes in there Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, and then he comes out, goes back to Bethany, where that fig tree is, and then his third trip back to the fig tree sees it doesn't have fruit, and he takes that as a what do you call that? A sort of a pedagogical device for his apostles, wherein he wants them to witness the cursing of the fig tree, and then later when after he's gone, they will apply and go, oh, remember when he cursed the fig tree? And he said, judgment is coming upon you, and it will be forever. Well, that's what happened to Jerusalem. You see, and they're all discussing. You can see them all talking about it. And, oh, yes, now we see it. Yes. So that fig tree sticks in their mind, you see, an emblem of what Jesus was talking about, so that they can associate it with the reality of what's going to happen in Jerusalem. You know, figures have a way of doing that when we think about them. So that's what's going on there, okay? And you know what? Another thing to say is you don't need to be divine to figure this out, okay? Because you see the utter apostasy that's occurring in Jerusalem at this point in time, where they wanted to kill him. It says it several times in the Gospels. They were not going to listen to him. The only solution was the final one, which is, let's murder him. Get him out of here. Okay? That's absolute apostasy. And you don't have to be divine to see that coming. Jesus put up with it for 3.5 years. Every time, this is why he spent most of his time in Galilee at the beginning, because he knew what Jerusalem was all about. Okay? He only came to Jerusalem one time in his life, basically. And that was for Passion Week, because he knew they were corrupt, totally corrupt. Okay? So he spent most of his time in Galilee, traveled up and down Perea and other places and did all his miracles and stuff. And that's why all the apostles were from Galilee, except Judas. And so, you know, like I said, you don't have to be divine to see all that. All right. Question: what are the quantum theory and quantum physics? What do you think about them? Well, they're valid scientific disciplines because we know that there is a very small world beneath the atomic world. Okay, and that's called the quantum world. Okay, I mean, just think of it. You have an atom, let's say the simplest atom, which is hydrogen. It has one electron and one proton. And the electron, whatever way you think of it, it's going around the proton somehow, some way. Okay, either the classical way or the cloud way that quantum physics sees it, where we can't pinpoint its location, but we know it's moving. Okay, so you have one proton, one electron. The atom, that is the whole spherical thing called the atom, okay, is mostly empty space. 99.9% of it's empty space. It's certainly not the electron and the proton. The proton, even though it's much, about 1,000 times bigger than the electron, it's in the center and it's relatively small compared to the sphere of the atom that it's in. And the electron, of course, is even smaller. And it's so small we can't even tell where it is in the atom. Okay? So what's in the rest of the atom? Well, somebody would say, it's empty space. Well, what's empty space? Are you saying it's space, but it's just empty? Okay, well then what's space? What constitutes space? Well, it's nothing. Well, sorry, you can't say that. Nothing doesn't exist by definition. You realize that, right? Okay, if you say it's nothing, that means there's nothing there, not even space. But since you've applied a label to it called space, that means it's a something. Now the question is, what is it? Okay, what is that something? that is in between the electron and the proton in the hydrogen atom. Well, that's what the quantum world is. Okay. Now you're getting down to the finest, most discrete part of nature. And this is where most of the theory about what it is, that space, is theoretical, because we don't have instruments that go down that far to figure out what the makeup of is that space between the electron and the proton. Even light waves are not that small. And that's how we see things, by light waves. But if the light waves are much bigger than the material that makes up that space, good luck. Okay. So now we have to theorize what that space is composed of. And believe it or not, we can do that. Okay. Because if we got certain constants that we believe are constants, like the Planck constant, speed of light constant, at least terrestrially, frequency, wavelength, we know how all that works. And we put these all together, shake them up, you get a theoretical particle called the Planck particle. That is the smallest possible particle that can exist, at least theoretically. When everything else is solid, you get this result called the Planck particle at 10 to the minus 35 meters, which is 20 orders of meters, 20 orders of magnitude smaller than the electron. Okay, now that's the basic particle of quantum physics, is the Planck particle. It's even smaller than the Higgs boson or anything else that you can think of. This is it. This is the limit. If you go past 10 to the minus 35 meters, you don't have matter anymore. It's not definable as matter. Okay? And that's a logical place to be, because you would say, look, I got this ball. I can cut it in half. Okay? Now I have half a ball. Now, what do I do with this? Well, I can cut that in half. Okay? Now I have a quarter of the original ball. Well, what can I do with it? Well, I can cut that in half. Okay? So you keep cutting in half every result that you have, and you're going to have to reach a limit as to when the cutting is not possible anymore. And that's what they call the Planck particle, theoretically, because we don't have any instruments, as I said, to go down there and measure it. We can only measure it mathematically by other mathematical constants that we know of. Okay? This is the way we have to do our science today. Okay? But the legitimacy of quantum theory is stated very plainly with the example I gave you, that you have an atom that has an electron and a proton, and they take up 0.01 or 0.0001% of the atom. So what else is in the atom then to make it this sphere? Okay, well, that's the quantum world. We know that it exists. Measuring it and showing how it works and all that, that's the difficult part. Okay, and we know a little bit of that, but, that's it. So, okay, hope that satisfies you. All right, how do we prove a child, to prove a child that God truly exists and that he's not some fiction fairy tale? Well, just take him out and walk in your backyard there. Whoever asked this question, Hubert. No, Tombfire. And say, see those trees there? See the ground here and all the grass growing? See the flowers in the garden? See the clouds in the sky? See the blue sky? See the birds flying? You hear all those tweets that those birds are making? They all make a different tweet. Okay? See all those bushes we have in our yard? They're beautiful. They're all different. And the trees, they're beautiful. They're all different. And some of them give us fruit. Look at that pear tree we have over there. And now take a deep breath for me. You feel that? That's air. That keeps you alive. Okay? And look at your body. You got eyes, nose, mouth, hair, limbs, heart beating, lungs breathing. Whenever you get hurt by a bee that's going to sting you, your nerves tell you so you can protect yourself. And everything's made to order. You see? That's the quickest way to a child's heart. Take him out for a walk. Point out all of nature to him. And he's going to be probably of an age, 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever, where he's going to know, look, things don't pop into existence by themselves. Everything I have to do, including making my bed or cooking my breakfast or, walking to school or doing my homework or obeying my parents, that takes work. Everything takes work. My bed just doesn't pop into, pristine position every time I wake up from it. This is not Alice in Wonderland. This is not, anything you see on TV. It just doesn't work that way. And he knows that. He's not stupid. Okay? And so you just pose the question, well, who made all this stuff here? All this beautiful stuff. Just made to order. Everything fits together. Who could have done that? And his answer is going to be God. Okay? He knows it's somebody greater than him. And you just put the label on it. Yeah. He's Elohim Yahweh. Jesus Christ. Whatever name you want to use. Okay? That's your job. Put the right labels on it. Because he knows how things work. He doesn't have to be taught that. He sees it every day of his life. All right. And if he doesn't accept that, then you're hopeless. All right. Question. Last week you stated that you didn't believe accepted teachings of the church fathers on the nature of the beatific vision. Does that mean that anyone can still fall away from God anytime? I don't see the logic of your question here. Well, let's put it this way. See, a lot of things that I say get twisted, and that maybe is my fault because I say a lot of things. But I didn't reject the beatific vision, okay? I'm just saying that the beatific vision is not all there is to God. Because if Thomas had his way, we'd be just looking at the beatific vision for 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 years, and that's it. Okay, that's all we do. I don't buy that. I believe there is a beatific vision because of the fact of God's essence will be displayed to us in full. Okay, but God's going to create a new heaven and a new earth, as 2 Peter 3, verse 10 to 13 says. Okay? That means we're going to have something like we have now, although it's going to be new and incorruptible, without any death or sin or cataclysms or whatever that we've experienced on this earth now. Okay? We're going to have a new heaven and a new earth. The scripture does not say we're going to have the beatific vision, period. So this is why there has been much discussion between the fathers and the medievals about what constitutes the new world and what are we going to be doing there and what can we expect to be there. Okay. Well, I think scripture came pretty close. It said, we will see God, definitely. If you want to call that the beatific vision, that's fine. But that's not it. We're going to be living in a new heaven and new earth. There will be no more marriage. Okay. We will be in perfect form to last for eternity, incorruptible, probably way beyond our imagination of what it could be. I mean, we could probably think what we could possibly have as our bodies, but it's going to be spectacular, absolutely. And yes, we'll have God as a vision. It says God will be the light in the apocalypse. And so, yeah, there it is all the time. But we're going to be living in the new heaven and new earth, which implies something close to, but not exactly like we have here, where we're living. We communicate with each other, all that stuff. That's involved in living. Okay. So that's what's going to be going on as well. That was my point, is that if you look at Aquinas, it's just, you become a contemplative being, and that's it. Okay. And because he's Thomas, everybody goes, ooh and ah, and, okay, well, that must be it because Thomas said it. Well, I'm sorry. I don't go there. Okay. Especially after I've done the research on it. And I find out that St. Augustine had a totally different view of what we are going to behold in the afterlife. Okay. He's the guy that says, no, we're going to be moving around. We're going to be living. We're going to be doing this and that and the other thing. And then there's a lot of saints following him that agreed. Okay. And then you have the scholastic period, where you have scholastics trying to figure it out. Then they were contemplatives. Okay. There's a whole new phase in Christianity that came about. And that's how they saw their beginning and end. Okay. But it doesn't make it gospel. All right. And what we need to learn, look, just because Thomas said it doesn't make it true. Okay. And I'll be the first to tell you that. Brilliant man. He helped Christianity a lot. And I go to him as one of the authorities, but I can tell you safely, not everything Thomas said was right. Okay. And especially in this area where nobody really knows for sure. That's why we have so much speculation on it. Just what is the new heaven and new earth going to be? Okay. So, all right. Next question. Why didn't the Bible ban slavery? Unbelievers will misquote Leviticus 25 to show that Jews can enslave non-Jews forever. In Exodus 21, where a father can sell his daughter as a sex slave. Let me see. What do I want here? All right. So in the ancient times, which are different than our times, okay, we need to have the proper definitions. Slavery in our time is to put someone under our authority wherein he has no rights to do anything unless we allow him to do those things. Like fighting the Civil War? Sure, you could fight the Civil War. Even though you're a slave, we need combatants. So yeah, you're allowed off the reservation and into the fighting arena. Yeah, we can make an exception for that. Okay, but they had no rights. Okay, everything that was given to them or they lived by was from the landowner that they lived with. Every aspect of their life, when they would eat, what they would eat, who they would visit, who would visit them, what work they would do, how long they would do it, and they would get paid a certain wage, and it would not be to get them rich, that's for sure. And we need those cotton fields picked. And we don't have any machines to do it. Eli Whitney hadn't come along yet. Okay. So you're going to slave out there in that hot sun, and you're going to get thorns, in your fingernails, because we need it. And by this time, capitalism was growing by leaps and bounds, and the MO of capitalism is basically to use whatever labor you can get the cheapest, so that you can make the most profit. Okay, very simple. So here you have basically had this is the epitome of what a Webster Dictionary slave is going to tell you. Okay. This was not the case back in the Old Testament. Okay. When God allowed the Israelites to have slaves, he made provisions that the rights of the slave always be followed at the cost of the death of the Jew who owned him if he didn't do it properly. Okay, that means proper amount of food, land, everything. So these were more like what we had understood of the second phase of a slave, which is called indentured servitude. Okay, yeah, you were owned by the landowner, but at a compensation that gave you rights for you and your family, that did not treat you like you were some monster, that respected your life and took care of it. You needed medicine, they'd give you medicine. Food, whatever, anything that you needed, they were taken care of. Okay. Now, it just so happens in that day where Israel was the theocracy, and that meant that all the other nations were not under God. And that's the way God wanted it. So as long as the Israelites were obedient, God was going to make them number one nation. Okay. And purposely so, because these other nations were evil. This is the whole reason why the Israelites conquered Canaan. It was promised to Abraham, and God says, 400 years from now, your ancestors are going to go conquer the Canaanites. And why can't they do it now? Because the iniquity of the Amorites and the Canaanites is not yet to the full. That's the reason. So God's waiting until they show true signs of total, absolute anarchy and disobedience. And then he allows the Israelites to come in there and destroy them. Okay, so everything's done in God's timing. So it's not like God didn't treat the nations with respect and honor. They had that from God, as long as they were obedient. But once they crossed that line, then God's going to allow his theocratic nation, who he's made number one, to go in there and destroy them. And it happened over and over and over again. Okay, so Israel was the number one nation. And so if you wanted to be part of that, but you weren't a Jew, you were a Gentile, well, you could do so, but you would do so as a slave. Okay, you would be under the ownership of the Jews. Okay, that's just the way it was. So it's not slavery in the same sense that we had, before the Civil War, where now slavery, these guys had no rights. Okay, and the white man wanted it that way because that's the way we can keep complete control over them. Otherwise, they're going to go to the north, where there is no such slavery. Okay, and then what's going to happen to our cotton crop? The whole thing's going to, go kaput. Can't have that. Okay, so and then of course you have a country, the United States, that came from oppression in England under George III, was it? where the people were beginning to be treated like slaves under George III, and had no freedoms, especially religious freedom. Okay, so um, they wanted freedom. Okay, and they came to the United States and they got it. Started a new nation. They had it. So freedom was in our blood when we first started. That's the whole reason why we have a nation, based on the idea of being free, a free people. And but now we have slaves that are not free. Well, see, time's caught up with us. 1776, we all were basing things on freedom. And now what? 80 years later, we see the same problem. We're treating part of our population like King George treated us. Well, that can't be. Okay, so that's what started the whole ball rolling, and we see the results of it. Okay, so I hope that is sufficient. Why is there death in the new heaven and new earth according to Isaiah 65:20? All right, I'm going to skip this question for now because I'm working on this right now, and I will have an answer for you next time. So it's funny that you asked that because I was just thinking of that today and the work that I'm doing on it. And so I am going to probably give like a 20-minute, thing on that next time. And again, thank you for asking that question. Okay. Next question. Why are we using a Roman calendar instead of the biblical calendar? Well, we have sort of a modified Roman calendar because Gregory, what was it, Gregory the 15th? Reorganized the calendar so that Easter would come on the proper days of the year because it was getting out of hand. But prior to that, we had the Julian calendar from the Romans, okay, after Emperor Julius. And so now a biblical calendar is what the Jews have, basically, okay? But that's based on a lunar cycle. And so it's quite different than the one we have, which is based on a solar cycle. Okay. So therein the difference. It just came about that whoever rules the world is going to make the calendar. And that's why the Romans use the Roman calendar. Okay. And it, if you use, and they tie that to the Olympiads, they have the Olympiads every 4 years. And we know that the starting point for the Olympiads, we also had 2 other date lines that started with the Olympiads and followed through. So we had 4 date lines that eventually gave us the Julian calendar. Okay, so it's pretty precise, very precise. And it's the best precision that we know of, because the lunar cycle can change a little bit depending on how long it's going to take the moon to go around the earth. Sometimes it's 27 days, sometimes it's 28 days. So you have to take all that into account. Okay, it makes it a little complicated. It's not that you can't do it, it's just that it's very difficult. And it's cut up into 19 sections, whereas the solar calendar is cut up into 12, which makes it easier to handle. Okay. So that's why we have it, because it worked, and it worked well. So there was no reason to change it. Okay, back to a biblical calendar. Now the Jews still keep their calendar. I think it's like the year 5700 in their calendar, somewhere around there. And that's okay, because that actually helps keep the solar calendar in line, because we compare the two each year and see that everything's jibing together. But the Roman calendar, not only was it accurate, it was in the time of the great leaders of the world, from 200 BC to 400 AD, 600 years. That's a long time. Okay, so, all right. Question: why is there something rather than nothing? Nobody's ever asked that before. Because just the fact that you're asking the question is the answer. How's that? And that's all I'm going to say. All right. Next question. How do I answer the Earth was created millions of years ago? Because scientists have seen how long it takes to compress a layer of rock or something else. I forgot. Okay. Up until probably the 1960s, and if you backtrack to Lyell and Darwin and a few other guys, which would be like 1840s, 50s, 60s, and Darwin came out with his book on evolution in 1859. Okay. The going theory in the mid 1800s was that the layers that we see in the Grand Canyon or in other parts of the world took millions of years to create. Okay. So a pile of mud, a few feet thick, would be spread on the ground and it would harden. Okay. And it's supposed to take millions of years. Okay. And then another layer of mud would be put on that layer, and then that would harden, and that would take another million years or so, however they calculate it. Okay. I missed a question up here. I'll get back to that as soon as I get done here. So that was the going theory. Okay, that it took millions of years for this wet mud to harden to give us the strata that we see in the Grand Canyon. Okay, then they started to do some experiments, and some secular people, but a lot of Christians who were getting into the science now in the 1960s rejected that theory that it took millions of years for these layers of mud to turn into rock. And they did so not because it was just theoretical, that, well, we need an answer to this evolutionary hypothesis, and here it is. They did experiments, many, many experiments. They got soil samples from the Grand Canyon, from beaches in Italy, everywhere in the world. They got samples and they examined these samples, and they did not see the theory, the evolutionary theory, where it took millions of years for these layers to be created. They saw just the opposite. What they saw was that these layers could be made in a matter of weeks, sometimes days, if you have the right water flow and you have a gradation of the size of the sediments in the water. Because what would happen is, as the water moves, the sediments will move with it, but in such a way where the heavier sediments will go to the bottom, then the medium sediments will go on top of them, and then the lighter sediments will go on the top. And that's exactly the way you would figure it would work. The heaviest would go down to the bottom first. And then what they saw was that the process would repeat itself. So once the light layer of sediments were on top, then you would get the water continue to flow, and then it would put the large sediments on top of the light, and then the medium, and then the light. So you'd have a repetition of the layers. And then if you let it go further, you would see the heavy elements again. For the third time now, they're on the light elements, and the medium, and then the light. Kept repeating itself over and over again. Okay. And this is what we find in the Grand Canyon. This is what we find in all the soil samples taken all over the world. We see basically 3 gradations, and this gradation repeats itself over and over. And the experiments showed that that can happen in days and weeks, maybe months, but it happens very quickly. Okay. Now, that answers the question of how could the evolutionists expect that a layer of mud that's laid down has to dry in order for the next layer to be laid on it? Because if it wasn't dry, then the 2 layers or the 2 sediments would start to mix. Okay. So how is it that you're going to have this layer dry in millions of years just in time now for the next layer to be put on top? And that's going to have to dry for millions of years. Really? How's that working? Okay. First of all, it's going to take millions of years? Hardly. But they need millions of years, because they already think the dinosaurs came 65 million years ago. So you're going to have a lot of gradations in that little column in the Grand Canyon before you get to the dinosaurs. Okay. Especially this, and of course, nowadays they're having problems with that too, because the dinosaurs have been found very near the surface, not what you would call 65 million years below the surface. Okay. And they've been found with soft tissue in them as if they haven't been there that long. Okay. So they're having big problems with that, but that's another story. So these, you can read all about this in my book, Scientific Heresies. Okay. I name all the individuals that are involved, some secular, some Christian, who all found the same thing, that all these layers happen in a very short amount of time. As long as you have the right water flow, which is like 2 meters per second or something like that, it's all going to appear the way we see it today. Okay. All right. Oh, here's the other question I missed. I'm a religion teacher for teenagers, and in our school system is enforced a unit on climate change. How can I engage this issue from a biblical point? Well, you can't, because the Bible is not going to get into that kind of detail. Okay. You're going to have to fight this from the secular evidence, and that's where most of the fight is. I don't know too many people who are, pointing to a chapter and verse in the Bible to fight climate change. You've got to show them that the temperature really hasn't changed a whole heck of a lot over, 500 years, that if it has changed, it's less than a degree, but yet it goes right back to where it was before because we have cycles, in the climate. We've known that for years. Okay. The climate change, it's all political, has nothing to do with science. Okay. They want to try to get people to rally around something. You have to have a God that they can worship. That's what's going on here. So let's all worship climate change. Let's all worship the earth. And we can't have our God destroyed because we love this earth. That's what it's all about. It's just another god that they're chasing. And the only way you can fight it biblically is to say, look, God knew what he was doing when he made the earth. And just take them through it a little bit. Do you know if the sun was any closer to the earth than 93 million miles, we'd burn up to a crisp? Do you know if it was any further from the earth, we'd freeze to death? There would be no life on earth. Do you know if the sun was any bigger than it is now, we'd all burn up to a crisp? If it was any smaller, we'd all freeze to death. Okay? So what does that tell you when God made things? That he made it perfect. Okay? Made the sun the right size, the earth the right size, gave them the right distance apart so that we can enjoy a 72-degree weather with no humidity. It's so beautiful here in Pennsylvania today. Okay? Only when things are just right are you going to get that kind of a result, and get it every day. Okay? And that's just the sun and the earth. What about all the other things that God made? The stars and everything else. It all fits together. So this guy knew what he was doing. All right. So how does that bode for this whole climate change? As if we're now going to fall off a cliff because somehow, because if you believe in evolution, it can evolve any way it wants to go. Here, there, everywhere it could evolve to. And you don't have a clue where it's going to end up. But with God behind it, it's going to last till the last day. Because even on the last day, it's going to take a miraculous, supernatural act of God to destroy it all. That's how stable it is. God's going to have to come in and stop it. Okay? So, from a biblical angle, that's the way you would attack it. And then you're going to have to back it up by your own science research into this. Okay? And there's plenty of it out there. You don't have to search long and hard to get it. It's all over there. Because this is a big war today. All right. How do I answer the earth was created millions of years ago? Okay. All right. What do you regard a modest dressing in men and women? Please be specific. No one in the Catholic sphere will address this. It's either not addressed at all or just full-on puritanical. Yes. Well, let's start with the bathing suits. Okay. My opinion, which I gave last week. Okay. Nobody in our house wears a bikini. That's for sure. And we make sure all the necessary parts are covered before I allow them to put on a bathing suit. And once they get that in their head, okay, that the object of fashion is not to show as much flesh as possible, but to conceal as much as possible without being prudish, that's the key that you're going to need. Okay, I think it was Calvin Klein who said, fashion is nothing but taking another layer of clothing off for the next season. Okay, so this is what's behind it all. Get away with as much as possible. Okay. And I think another good key here is don't leave to the imagination as much as possible. Well, leave to the imagination as much as possible. Okay. That's a good recipe to follow for how you dress. So, the Bible's very clear in Leviticus. The nakedness of so-and-so is for so-and-so, not for you. And it goes through all the relationships, when you're tending toward being naked, okay, it's just common sense. Nobody really has to teach you. When you have a low-cut dress on a woman, yeah, you're tending toward nakedness. When you have a high-cut dress, starting from the bottom, you're tending toward nakedness. Okay. There's no hard and fast line you can draw, but you know from your common sense what you need to cover up. Okay? No women should be showing their breasts or their butts. That is not a, um, you know, that is not territory that we need to be investigating. Okay? That's what I mean by common sense. And that goes for any other piece of clothing they put on. You need to teach them modesty, modesty above all things. Okay? Now, we're not going to go wear the, what do they call that in the Muslims, where the women cover themselves and all you see is their eyes. I mean, that's ridiculous. Okay? We all know that. But the sensitive areas of our body, we know what they are. Okay? And we know that those particular parts will be titillating to some people and therefore they cannot be seen. We know that. And that's the general rule you're just going to have to follow. It's not going to be easy every day, okay? But that's what you're going to have to follow, okay? All right. Question. So a balanced view on this topic from would be really okay. Have you publicly addressed any areas of disagreement with your friend and colleague EMJ? That's E. Michael Jones. I can infer some areas after realizing that his history of logos far exceeds 6,000 years. Yeah, and when he was writing that book, I discussed this with him. And I said, Mike, come on, if you're going to go by the Bible, you ain't going to find 60,000 years or 90,000 years or whatever. He's the kind of guy that he's not going to give a yes or no unless he can go and study it himself and has the time to do so. Okay. And I've talked to him about this. We had a debate proposed, and he didn't want to go into it because he just wasn't prepared, I think, to go into it. Because he really hasn't studied this area, okay? So he's one of those intellectual guys that he's, very smart in very needed areas, and we appreciate his work. But in some other areas, he just hasn't spent the time, okay? And this is the result of it. So, that's where it laid. All right. We got a few more minutes left. Did you read Logos Rising or enough to make some comments? I haven't actually read it yet. I just read parts of it. We do have it. Just now talking about time. I don't have enough time to get in there and read it. But I pretty much know where he's coming from. I think Mike's view is that somehow Christianity is going to win the war because the people on the other side are slowly but surely being exposed for what they're doing. And it's almost inevitable that the Logos is going to win. I don't take that view. Okay. Going by the Bible, I see that nation after nation after nation would rise and then they would fall. And some other nation would take over. That's what we've seen from the time of Cain and Abel to the present. Nothing's changed. Just the names have changed to protect the innocent. So I don't see a progression of the Logos in this world. I believe that what St. Paul says is that there will be an apostasy, and then after that, the man of sin will come, and after that, Jesus will come, and will put an end to it all. Okay? So I don't see a philosophical rising of the logos as um, the the wheel or woe of this world. I just don't see that. I see that the logos is going to allow us to win certain victories, and I see where the logos is not going to work at all, and they will overtake us. And as I said, this has been the pattern of the world since the beginning, and it's not going to stop. It's just not going to stop because evil's not going to roll over. If there's one thing they've shown, it's that they're not going to roll over. So everything we do is going to be a struggle. We use the logos as our tool to make a dent as much as we possibly can, but that's only to find the elect. It's not to basically try to change the world. We only want to change the world to the extent that we can survive and live and produce children for the kingdom of God. So if we have that much, we're doing good. And God allows that. And the moment that we have enough for the kingdom of God for eternity, bang, it's going to end. Okay? And that's right at the end, right after the Antichrist, the man of sin, has his reign for however long that's going to be. And it's going to be a little season. It's not going to be real long. And it's going to get really bad then. You think the logos is having a rough time now. You wait till the man of sin gets in power. He will control the world. And the logos will be a distant memory. Okay? Until the logos comes back on the white horse and destroys the man of sin, as the apocalypse tells us, and starts a new heaven and new earth. Okay? And believe me, God is I don't want to use a bad analogy, but he's waiting with bated breath to have this world over. Because not until it is over will we be assured of our logos working for eternity. Okay, until then, men who hate the logos are going to keep coming after it. Okay, so we're going to be in a constant war. So it's rising, but it's not going to rise far enough. Okay, it's only rising because this is the nature of time. One guy rules and then he goes corrupt and another guy replaces him. In between times, we live and survive. That's the way I look at it. Okay. All right, one more question. Indian Paintbrush says JP2 got rid of the devil's advocate so he could get the likes of Jose Escrivá canonized. I've done extensive research into Opus Dei, his conduct history. He could never pass scrutiny if it was in place. You know what? I don't disagree with you, Indian. I've done my own research on it, and it's just another rabbit hole. The further you go down, the further you have to go down, and it's not pretty. It's just not pretty. So, yeah, I tend to agree with you. And unfortunately, and he's already told us what he would do in the case of Father Maciel. Okay? Father Maciel is a known pedophile, adulterer, whoremonger, and as long as he kept giving money to the Vatican, there was just no investigation into the guy. Okay, so John Paul already showed us what he would do for his friends. And here's another issue. Escrivá, you examine his life. This guy, as far as I know, was also a pedophile. Okay, and they tried to cover it up. So talk about a rabbit hole. So thank you for mentioning that. Okay, so we're done for today. Sorry I couldn't get to your other questions here, but thank you for coming. I hope I have been helpful to you in your walk with the Lord, and that you are stronger today than you were before you came. That's my goal for you. And thank you for all your questions. If I didn't get to you today, I'll get to you next week. So don't be shy. Keep coming back. And please stop over to robertsongenis.org if you would and give us a donation. We have plenty of books and other things for you to see, so feel free to purchase them. All right, we'll see you next week, which would be what? June the 7th. All right, see you then, guys.